Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of July 2025, and there were some really good ones this month, so I'm excited to share what I was able to get through with you. The first book that I picked up is one called The Poppy Fields by Nikki Erlick, and Nikki Erlick is also known for a book called The Measure, which I absolutely loved. The Poppy Fields is basically about, it's kind of like a futuristic speculative fiction novel about a situation where people who are grieving can basically go to sleep for a period of time to try to kind of like process through the grief of usually losing a loved one. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is I heard there was a connection between this book and Wizard of Oz with Poppy Fields. And I would say I like The Measure better in terms of just kind of the pacing and the plot and the ideas, but I thought this one was a pretty solid novel as well. Next, I picked up a book called What We Find by Robin Carr. I've read a bunch of different books by Robin Carr over time. She writes basically kind of like small town romance. And this book I picked up because it is the first in a series that was made into a adapted television show. And I wanted to kind of check that out. I would say that this was pretty standard romance fare. Like nothing really stood out to me about this particular book. I don't know that I would read more in this series, but it gave me enough to be able to check out the television show, which I haven't done yet, but I'll pick that up soon. Then I picked up a book that I have heard about for a very long time, and I've never read this author. It is Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. Now, if you are familiar with Francine Rivers, you will know she writes Christian fiction. And I had heard about this book for a long time. It's basically, it's based on a biblical story. It is about a young girl who is basically sold into prostitution. And she is somewhat kind of like rescued from that situation by this man who wants her to become his wife. And he's basically been told by God to marry this woman. And it's basically a story about how like love conquers all a little bit in terms of like this woman is very damaged. She's very broken. And this relationship with this man is kind of trying to heal her over time. It also has a very interesting narrative in terms of kind of how she begins to work toward like a social justice mission, which I wasn't necessarily expecting, but this is a book that I've known about probably since I was a teenager. I'd heard about it and I'd heard it was very good and I'd never read it. So I picked that up as well. Then I picked up a book called The Maid's Diary by Lorith Ann White. And Lorith Ann White is an author I picked up, I don't know, maybe like 6 months ago for the first time. And I've been kind of working my way through other books on her backlist. I hadn't realized she's someone who's written a lot, usually mystery, kind of suspense novels. And the book I picked up was one that was like getting a lot of press. And then I realized, she's actually written quite a bit more. So it's like she'd written all these books and it took like this one particular book to kind of get her some more attention. So when that happens with an author, I always like to go and read their backlist because I feel like they've already like honed their craft through all of these other novels. This book is basically about a maid that works for this family, and through a lot of twists and turns, there's kind of like a murder mystery that happens, and she has a diary, and this becomes part of the plot. This book reminded me of actually a couple other books that have featured maids that I've read recently, but I enjoy that premise, and I think it's kind of interesting because maids have this way of like getting behind the scenes, of different households, which I think adds this like interesting element to a mystery. All right, then I picked up 4th of July Creek by Smith Henderson. I did read it on the 4th of July just because it seemed like a fun thing to do. This is a book about a social worker who gets to know this man and his child. And the man is kind of like living off grid and is a bit of like a fundamentalist in terms of thinking about like anti-government and things like that. And he becomes kind of embroiled in this situation with his family. I actually had heard about this book for a very long time and I'd heard it was very good. I did enjoy it. I thought it was well written. I do think this is definitely more in kind of like the literary fiction genre, if that's something that sounds interesting to you. Then I picked up a book by Lisa Leong called This Working Life: How to Navigate Your Career in Uncertain Times. The author of this book is coming out of Australia and has like some really interesting meditative components built into the book. I did listen to it on audio, and I would recommend listening to it on audio because of those kind of meditative components. There were a lot of exercises that she kind of recommends for thinking about your career and how to kind of navigate it through times of uncertainty. And I really liked this one. I could definitely see recommending this to like people I'm coaching around career and things like that. Then I picked up a book called Heidi Lucy Loses Her Mind. This is the second book in a series by Gracie Ruth Mitchell. And the first book is called Juniper Bean Resorts to Murder. And these are just charming books. I really, really like this one. I would absolutely continue reading in this series. Basically, this is about a woman who owns a bookstore, and she has kind of like a secret crush on this author who comes into the bookstore. And one day they're both in the bookstore together, and this woman dies, and it turns out that she's been murdered. And so they get kind of like pulled into this, murder, and they're kind of amateur detectives. And there's a conceit as part of the plot that the main character, a couple days previously, had like hit her head, and she had like brief amnesia. And so there's all these things they're trying to figure out that she can't remember. This was a really fun one. I would definitely recommend it. All right, then I picked up a book called The Age of Diagnosis by Suzanne O'Sullivan. And the subtitle of this is How Our Obsession with Medical Labels is Making Us Sicker. This author is really talking about how there are certain kinds of conditions that are over diagnosed, and that maybe that's causing a problem for the people who actually have the condition, and that it's kind of like watering down, like how we think about certain conditions. I thought this was really interesting. I will say there were some things in here about diagnosis that felt kind of challenging in terms of like, I've been reading a lot of things, as you've heard in previous months, on neurodiversity. And one of the things she talks about is diagnosing neurodiversity, and that it's becoming kind of harder to do. And I also think that I've read other books that have basically said like the diagnostic criteria for some of this stuff is really like weak, or it needs to be challenged. It needs to be like dealt with in a deeper way. And so I felt like there was some stuff in this book that some people would disagree with, in terms of like how these diagnostic tests are working and whether they're working. But it was an interesting perspective, and I'm glad that I picked it up. Then I picked up a book by Liz Wiseman called Multipliers: How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. And this is basically a book that talks about two different kinds of leadership. One kind where you are kind of more like generous to the people around you and you're trying to lift them up. And then another kind of leadership where you're kind of doing the opposite, and you're kind of like trying to get all the attention on yourself, and like you have a hard time collaborating, and you're not necessarily there for the betterment of the people around you. And you can guess which one the author is arguing for here. They give a lot of examples of like things you can emulate if you're trying to be a leader that is a multiplier, that's kind of making everyone around you better. And I really like this book too. It had a lot of actionable things that I felt like I could immediately take into my work. All right, then I picked up a book called Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. And this is a book that I kind of stumbled across in some other reading I was doing. And one of the things that they emphasized was this is a book that's becoming a little bit central to the work of neurodiversity because of the definitions that are included in this work, and that a lot of people cite this work because of kinds of definitions that are coming out of it. And so that's partly why I picked it up. It's quite short, so it's relatively easy to get through. And I really did appreciate kind of the taxonomies that this author was putting together, and that they had taken the time to like publish, a series of essays basically. And it's been picked up, I think, by a lot of people and has been used in a lot of different ways. All right, next I picked up The Love Haters by Catherine Center. And I love a good Catherine Center novel. I just find that it's very hard for her to go wrong. I think that she has these really interesting premises of her romances. And she does a really nice job of making her characters real in terms of like adults that are like dealing with baggage and trying to come together and eventually, have a romance. This is a book that, if I'm remembering correctly, I did read quite a few books this month. This is the book that there's a woman who's like a video producer, and she ends up being assigned to go and do like a documentary about this rescue swimmer. And she doesn't know how to swim. And so there's like a whole thing around that that's pretty funny. And I really like this one too. I think that there's like a third act tension that comes up that feels a little silly to me. But overall, I thought this was a nice one. All right, then I picked up All the Devils by Barry Eisler. This is the, I think, fourth book in the Livia Lone series. And this is basically about a woman who is a police officer, but who's also kind of a vigilante. And she is specifically trying to kill people who are part of sex trafficking or the sex trade. And I would say that this was just another solid entry in the series. I'm not sure there's more books in this series. I think this might have kind of wrapped it up. But I really did like, the overall character that the author built this series around. And I mean, I ended up reading, I think, all 4 books that are currently available. All right, then I picked up Twisted Love by Anna Huang, and this is an author I don't think I've read before, but I see this book like everywhere, and so I thought I would pick it up. This is basically a romance that has the tropes of basically a dangerous male protagonist and a more innocent female protagonist. In this book, the male main character is basically in kind of like a gang, and he has killed people. I mean, like he is someone who is considered dangerous, and it's basically, the other trope is like best friend's sister. Basically, like he is best friends with her brother and has been asked to take care of her when the brother is out of town, and they begin, you know, to have feelings for each other. This is a series, I believe, that continues on in the second book with another gangster character and his romance. So this is basically like the conceit of the series, is that you have these kind of like dangerous men and they're needing to have these relationships with more innocent women. I would say this is not like my favorite trope of romance, but it like this kind of morally gray, you know, male main character. But I was engaged in the plot and I thought it was interesting. It was quick moving. And especially at the end, you know, there were some interesting things that happened to the characters. So, all right, then I picked up a book called Distancing: How Great Leaders Reframe to Make Better Decisions by L. David Marquette. And this is a book that I actually found really fascinating. One of the things that it talks about is how you should try to give yourself a different time frame if you're like trying to make a hard decision, or if you're trying to kind of like look at a situation in a different way. So for example, you could think about like, what would myself say about the situation if it was 5 years from now? And I'm like looking back, and so you're trying to give yourself like some temporal distancing. He talks about other kinds of distancing as well, but I will say that the time part, the time distancing, was like the most compelling to me in terms of what this might look like. I would definitely recommend this book if you're interested in kind of like leadership development. There were some definite kind of like interesting concepts that I hadn't thought about before. All right, then I picked up a book called Job Therapy by Tessa West. I stumbled across this book, I don't know, a couple months back, and I was fascinated by the title. And I thought, okay, like, let me give this a whirl. And so I actually bought a hard copy of this. And this is a book that basically talks about 5 different reasons why you might feel like you need to move on from a job. And for example, one reason is like, I feel undervalued. Another example of a reason is I feel overwhelmed, you know, by the work that I have in front of me. And there were, you know, a bunch of these. And she kind of talks through like, what do you do if this is how you are feeling about your current job or career? There was another reason about like, you want to pivot to another industry basically. And it was really actually quite interesting to kind of work through these different things that she had outlined and to think about the different kinds of steps that you could take to feel like you had more agency if you were trying to make a decision like this. All right, next up I read a book called Wormwood Abbey by Christina Bear. And this is a book I like completely picked up on a whim. It's a young adult novel about this girl and her father, her family, and they inherit this old home. And once they go to the old home that they've inherited, there's other family members there, like cousins, and they are interacting with these people. And I don't want to give too much away, but I will say there's a magical element to this book that was very charming. And there's like a little mystery element to it as well. And this is relatively short, if I'm remembering correctly. It almost read like a novella. I think there's 5 books in this series. I like immediately went out and picked up the second one because I just thought it was so charming and I would absolutely keep reading it. In the beginning, I was like questioning it a little bit just because of the tone of the writing. But once I got into it, I actually found myself really enjoying it. All right, I also finished a series this month that I had been rereading. And this is the series by Chelsea Cain that is about a female serial killer named Gretchen Lowell, and the police officer who is like tracking her, and also who at one point was having an affair with her before he knew that she was a serial killer. So I read in relatively quick succession The Night Season, which is the 4th book in the series, Kill You Twice, which is the 5th book in the series, and Let Me Go, which is the 6th book in the series. And this is a series that I had probably read, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, and I wanted to revisit it this year just because I remembered really enjoying it. And I did really enjoy this series. I think that it's complicated. You do have this like really kind of challenging situation where you have a cop that's like basically obsessed, you know, with this woman, and she is doing horrible things and continues to be horrible to him as well. puts his colleagues and friends and family in danger. And he's continually trying to kind of like catch her or understand her, find her victims, because she's like this very prolific killer. So it's a really kind of complicated set of books, but I really did like this, and I'm glad that I revisited it this year. All right, then I picked up a book called Win by Harlan Coben. I've read a ton of Harlan Coben. He's very well known for kind of like suspense, mystery, with great plot twists. And this is a book about this guy who is basically like a vigilante. He's very wealthy, and he goes after people that basically like the law is not catching. And he gets sucked up into this mystery of, he has like a cousin who was kidnapped when she was like, I think in her 20s, and was rescued and found, but they never knew who did it. And then this clue like comes up out of nowhere. The police find this kind of dead body, and in his apartment, like there's this clue that gets tied back to this kidnapping. I really do love a mystery novel that goes back and forth in time, that there's like a cold case, or there's, you know, something that's happened in the past and then it gets connected to the present. This is a series that I will absolutely keep reading. I really liked this main character a lot, and I'd like to see kind of how he shows up in different books in the series. Okay, then I picked up a book called Time Anxiety by Chris Guillebeau. This is his latest book. I think I've read pretty much every book by this author. He writes nonfiction, and this is a book that is basically him processing a little bit about the fact that he was diagnosed with ADHD, and he's been kind of thinking about like, what does that mean in terms of how he works and how he kind of like offers himself accommodations, basically. And so in this book, he's basically talking to other people who have feelings like he has feelings about time. And I actually found this to be a really interesting book that I think would be very practical and very helpful for people who are struggling with the kinds of things that he is struggling with. Now, if you are not struggling with those things, I don't know how interesting you would find this book, but I could see the practical nature of it. And I could also see kind of the heartfelt emotion that he was like bringing to this topic, and his like true desire to help people with it. All right. Then I picked up a book called The Things We Water by Mariana Zapata. I have talked about this author in the past. I really have enjoyed her books. And this is her most recent book. And all of the things that I had seen about it were basically just raving. Like, it's really great. It's really amazing. So I'm like, okay. Basically, it's about a magical puppy. She finds this magical puppy, and then she goes to this ranch where, like, this is where magical creatures go. And she knew about it from her childhood. Like, there's this connection. And then she becomes, like, connected to this guy, and they start to have a romance. This book is about 700 pages. And I am sorry to say, I'm really sorry to say, I was just completely bored by it. I was not able to connect with any of the characters. I thought the plot was strange. I thought the dialogue was stilted. And so then I went and found some other reviews, and I was like, what are people saying about this? Like, what am I missing? And I found a couple other people that basically felt exactly as I did. And I thought, okay, this must be a book that just splits people one side or the other. You love it, or you just really don't like it, because that's what I seem to find in the reviews. So I, unfortunately, was on the not really liking it side. But I mean, I guess if you like magical puppies, try it and see what you think. I don't know what else to really say about that, other than I was disappointed, because I really do like this author, and I would absolutely revisit some of her sports themed romance in the future, just because I enjoy them so much. Then I picked up a book by Lynette Noni called Wandering Wild. This is the author of the Prison Healer trilogy, which I loved. And this is a YA romance about a actor who's basically trying to have a comeback because he's got some like reputational issues. And this girl who wins like a contest to go out into the woods with him and do this like survival trek. And I thought this one was fun. I mean, there's some nice scenes. There's some like little twists that happen throughout. I think that it's definitely YA in terms of like, I think it's pitched to that audience. I felt like the Prison Healer trilogy was a little more complicated and more kind of nuanced and sophisticated in terms of its plotting. But this was also, I thought, very well done. And I would continue to pick up books by this author. Okay, then I picked up a book called Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey. This is another book that people have really been raving about, and so I wanted to pick it up. It's about this man and his children, and they live in like Antarctica on like some island, and they're there because of science. Like, I mean, they go into a lot more detail about what kind of science, but just high level, they're there because he's a scientist. And this woman like washes up from this like boat accident and it like washes up on this island with them. And this book is basically the story of this woman and why she's there and how they come to get to know each other, basically. And what I would say is I thought this book was incredibly creative. Like the premise of it, the plotting, the characters, the motivations, like all of that was really interesting. I wouldn't say that I was like head over heels with this book in the way that other people seem to be, but it was very solid. And I think if you are interested in kind of that general concept, you should absolutely pick it up. All right, then I picked up a book called Healing the Modern Brain by Drew Ramsey. And I had seen this book in a couple of different places, and my local library happened to have a copy, and so I decided to pick it up. This is a book that basically tries to connect brain science with things like sleep and nutrition and meditation and other kinds of things that are kind of going to work well with your brain in modern life. I would say that there's not a whole lot of new that came out of this for me, but it's like a bunch of good reminders of like how to take care of yourself and how when you take care of your body, you're also taking care of your brain. So I appreciated that and I thought it was interesting. All right, next up I picked up a book called What Alice Forgot by Liane Moriarty. This is an Australian author. I have read her before and have enjoyed her fiction. This novel is basically about a woman who collapses like when she's at the gym. And when she wakes up in the hospital, she thinks that she's like in her 30s, but actually it's like 10 years later. And she, in her 30s, was like just having a child and she was in a marriage and like things were going well. And then she wakes up in her 40s and like she's getting divorced and like her kids are older and she's like dealing with being a very different person than she remembers herself being in her 30s. And so she has this kind of like amnesia situation that she's working through. This I thought was also a very creative book. I like where the author kind of took the plot elements and this idea of like, what if you woke up to yourself and you just were different? Like you were a stranger to yourself in some ways, rather than like seeing yourself age and change over time. You just wake up 10 years later and you feel very different. And I thought that was such an interesting way to kind of like frame a novel. So I will absolutely continue to read this author in the future. Okay, then I picked up 11/22/63 by Stephen King. And this is basically a revisionist history novel about a man who goes back in time to try to stop the assassination of Kennedy. And this is, there was a lot here that I wasn't expecting. First of all, I thought this would be completely about the Kennedy assassination. And I feel like you don't get to the Kennedy assassination part until about 2/3 of the way, at least, through this book. There's all this stuff that happens beforehand. This book is such a great example of how Stephen King just flexes into all of these genres. It's really incredible what he does with his books. He's a fantasy writer. He's a horror writer. He writes this, historical revisionist fiction. Like he really does have a creative mind. And I'm so impressed by his ability to kind of like write into all of these different directions. So I'm really glad I picked this one up. I will continue to read, broadly across all of the different genres he writes in because I find him really impressive. All right, then I picked up a book called The Thrashers by Julie Soto. I have read Julie Soto in the past as a romance writer, and this is her first, I think, YA thriller. And what I really liked about this book is it had this like fun paranormal element that comes in relatively early and that I wasn't expecting, but it was very like, I don't know, charming is like a weird word to use, but it did feel kind of charming in terms of like, there's like some seances and like connecting with spirits and stuff that happens in this book. And I actually really liked that element of it. Like it reminded me of like a good teen thriller movie in some ways. I could absolutely see this being adapted into a film, and it read pretty quickly. And I think Julie Soto is like having some fun, kind of like moving into some different genres. And I love seeing that with an author. So the next book I picked up is called Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. And this is an author who's known for writing like STEM themed romances. And in this book, you have two people who are interested in STEM as well. One of them is a competitive diver and the other is a competitive swimmer, and they swim on the same team for the same institution. They're in college and they begin to have a bit of a romance. And this is the complexity that was kind of interesting in this particular book is the female diver has been having kind of like fear-based challenges with diving, and she hasn't been able to dive well, and she's been going to therapy for it. And she also has like a history of almost like abuse from a father figure in her life, and so that kind of comes into the relationship as well. I really like, you know, the different elements that Ali Hazelwood brings into her books, and there's some of her earlier stuff that I like a little bit more than like the more recent things that I've been reading. But I think that this is, you know, solidly plotted, and I think she continues to like do that little like STEM theme throughout all of these different books that she's been writing. All right, then I read pretty much back to back a 6-book series called The Gallagher Girls, which is a YA series about teenage girls who are going to a special school in high school to learn to become spies. This was such a fun series, and I'll just read through the titles very quickly. The first book is called I'd Tell You I Love You, But Then I'd Have to Kill You. The second book is Cross My Heart and Hope to Spy. Then Don't Judge a Girl by Her Cover, Only the Good Spy Young, Out of Sight, Out of Time, and United We Spy. And these were just super fun. They're short, relatively short. I listened to them all on audio, and I just picked up one right after the other. They came through very creative, like really fun plots. Like I just wanted to keep knowing what was going to happen to these characters. So main character is a teenage girl. Her mother is the headmistress of this school for spies, and she has these kind of like best friend characters that surround her. They live there. This is like a school where you live at the school, and there's just all kinds of fun elements of like the classes they're taking. It had a little bit of like a Harry Potter-esque vibe because it's like the special school, and I really like that as well. So would definitely recommend this. I feel like this is a series that I'd completely skipped over when I was like of the right age to read it. And I saw somebody talking about it on social media, and they were just raving about it and how much they loved it when they were a teenage girl. And I thought, okay, like let me try that out. And I'm so glad I picked this one up. It was really fun. I also picked up a book called Curious Tides by Pascal Lascelles, not quite sure how to pronounce that. This is a fantasy novel, dark academia, about this school for mages. And there's a teenage girl who gets embroiled in kind of this like magical situation. And during the situation, which takes place kind of by an ocean, there are a bunch of students who drown and die. And she's not quite sure what happened. And she's kind of like trying to understand what happened in the situation. One of the people who dies is like her best friend, and she starts to like investigate the situation with her best friend's brother. And there's basically like these magical systems that people are not entirely sure how they work. And so they're like trying to understand what happened in the situation that would have caused the deaths of these students. And this is a series. There's definitely, I think, a second, maybe a third book in this series. And I would pick it up. I mean, I thought that the magic system that was created in this particular book was very good. This is very atmospheric. It has very, what's the way I want to describe it? Like the vibes of this book are very consistent in terms of like how it gets set up in the beginning, and just like how the author takes those kind of tropes and themes and draws them throughout the entire book. Very immersive. So I really did like this one, and I would consider picking up the next one in the series as well. So the next book that I picked up is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. And this is a book that I've also heard mixed reviews on. Emily Henry is a contemporary romance writer, and this is a book about basically two people, a man and a woman, who are competing to write the biography of this famous woman. And they both kind of show up to her home, and they're having these conversations with her, and she's trying to decide between the two of them. This is a book that was very reminiscent of the 7 Lives of Evelyn Hugo, or the 7 Lives of Evelyn Hugo? 7 Wives of Evelyn Hugo? 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo? I'm not getting this title right. But there is a book about Evelyn Hugo, and she's basically this like Hollywood starlet, and it had those vibes. I think it's 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Can't believe I cannot remember this. But she, in this particular book, like there's kind of these elements that are similar to that story, and that you have like this Hollywood starlet that's like telling about her past history and her relationships and things like that. I thought this was actually very intricately plotted, and I liked it a lot. I think that some people see this as a bit of a departure from the typical Emily Henry. It felt a little more literary fiction to me than kind of contemporary romance, but I thought that was a good thing. You know, I liked that she was kind of taking that turn with this book. All right, next up I read Driven to Distraction at Work by Edward Hallowell. Edward Hallowell is a doctor and a specialist in ADHD. And in this particular book, it's kind of similar to another book of his that I read called Crazy Busy, where he's basically saying there are a lot of people who have attention challenges, but it is not ADHD or ADD. It is just the fact that we are living in a contemporary world that causes you to have attention challenges. And so in this book, he basically diagnoses like 6 different ways that this can look at work. And then he talks about how to fix that. And this is everything from like, you know, I look at screens too much, to I get disrupted too much or interrupted, you know, in my work. And so I found this interesting, and I appreciate that he's trying to kind of reach an audience that he sees the challenges and he doesn't want these people to be ignored just because they don't have a formal diagnosis. So I thought that was interesting. Then I picked up a book called Trauma-Informed Yoga Therapy for Supporting Asylum Seekers, Refugees, and New Immigrants by Gina Barrett. Now, this might be kind of an interesting book for you to think that I'd be reading, but I am in the middle of a yoga therapy training program where I am kind of furthering my yoga training. I'm also a certified yoga teacher and a certified meditation teacher. And so I'm doing a deeper dive on yoga at the moment. And this was a book that really stood out to me as kind of being very niche. And I thought it was really an interesting topic. Very short, really easy to kind of go through. And it was just kind of like talking about what are some of the cultural competencies you need to be thinking about if you're basically working with folks either coming into the United States who have other cultures or working with immigrants and refugees in other countries if you have you know, a yoga practice that you're doing in other countries. So learned a lot from that. It was really interesting. Then I picked up The Pocket Guide to Neurodiversity by Daniel Ahern. Daniel Ahern is writing out of the UK, and so he had a lot of really interesting kind of like statistics and things that were more UK focused than US based about neurodiversity. He also works at a company or has kind of created a company that helps to place autistic people in the workplace. And one of the statistics that I've seen in a lot of different places is anywhere between 70 to 80% of people who have autism are not working full-time for a number of different reasons. And you may feel like that number is just like astronomically high, and it is astronomically high. Like that is a crazy amount of people who are unable to work full-time in the workplace. And so one of the things he kind of focuses on is that, how do we think about accommodation? How do we design, you know, workplace structures that allow for people who have different needs, you know, to be successful? In this particular book, he kind of just gives like a high-level overview. He focuses specifically on autism, dyslexia, ADHD, and something called dyspraxia. And he kind of talks through each of these 4 things and how they can kind of show up in different ways in the workplace. The last book that I picked up in this month was called Head Cases by John McMahon. This is a book about an FBI agent who works in kind of like a cold case unit. And he also actually presents as like neurodiverse in some way. It's not really named, but he's someone who like recognizes patterns and like his brain just kind of thinks differently about these crimes that he's encountering. And basically what happens is in this book, there's a serial killer who is killing other serial killers and is kind of taunting this team of FBI agents. And I was like completely sucked into this book. It was super interesting. And the author has written other things before. I've not encountered him in the past, but one of his other books was called like one of the best mysteries of all time or something like that. And I like immediately went and found it. I was like, I want to read more. But I really liked this. It read very cinematically. I could see it being like a TV show. If you're a fan of like Criminal Minds, you know, this would definitely be a book that I would consider picking up. I did listen to it on audio and I felt like I probably read it in like 1 or 2 sittings. It was a very, very quick one for me. So those are all of the books that I read in July of 2025. Some really, really fun ones in there. And I'm really also looking forward to this upcoming month of reading. So check out my TBR video for August of 2025 to see what I'm going to read in the coming month. And I hope you'll check back and see what I was able to get through. Until then, happy reading.